Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 25 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Vancouver Canucks and won by a score of 3-2. A couple of nights ago, the Sharks went into Colorado and got absolutely crushed by the Avalanche, a 6-0 loss, but I wasn't all too negative about the team after that one. I wasn't sounding the alarm bells or anything like that, because it was a game that I felt as though the Sharks were kind of expected to lose. I outlined a bunch of different factors in my previous review for why I thought the Sharks kind of had the deck stacked against them, and so while a 6-0 loss was disappointing to see how just lopsided it was, a loss all the same was kind of expected in my eyes, and instead I was carrying my excitement into today's game against the Canucks because it was an opponent that I felt as though was much more at the Sharks' speed. The other game against Colorado, the Avs have just completely dominated their opponents throughout this season in terms of shot attempts, in terms of scoring chances, while the Canucks have been essentially the polar opposite of the Avs. They have been dominated instead in terms of shot attempts and scoring chances, and I can say that because the Sharks have as well, and so these were two teams that were kind of at a similar level. And so I was expecting a pretty exciting matchup in this game, but it ended up getting a little bit tainted, not because of anything that the Sharks did, not because of anything that the Canucks did, but instead because of what the officiating crew ended up doing here tonight. But I'll get to that a little bit later. Instead, we'll start out in the first period where the Canucks get on the board early. This is a goal from Brock Besser, makes it 1-0 just a few minutes into this game, but then it is Will Smith who ties the game up at 1. Nice to see him get this goal. His last couple ended up getting called off, one due to offside and another due to a distinct kicking motion. It was a funny joke from the NHL, but it did not end up counting. And so he is able to get back on the board for the first time in a decent bit, and ends up happening on the power play, which was also important for the Sharks. It is no secret that the Sharks power play has been completely terrible for these last few weeks, but if there was only one positive that you could take out of that Colorado Avalanche game, it was that the Sharks power play did a pretty decent job, and they were able to carry that momentum into this one, and that gets them the 1-1 game-tying goal. Heading into the second period, the Canucks are able to take their lead back with a nice solo effort in front of the net from Elias Pettersson. That makes it 2-1. However, it is at that point where the officials really end up taking this game over, and it starts with an odd penalty being called on Canucks captain Quinn Hughes. He gets nailed for the unsportsmanlike conduct penalty, and it's always rather difficult to comment on such a penalty because we don't know what was said. For all we know, Quinn Hughes ends up crossing like 6 different lines, and the officials finally get him for that, but realistically it feels as though this was a pretty weak call, and then what ends up happening is that the Canucks take a tripping penalty on the ensuing power play for the Sharks, and this was a fair call, and it puts them down by 2, and the Sharks get a 5-on-3, which they are then able to use to tie this game up at 2. And obviously there was, some pretty ill feelings on the Canucks, but this is a good time to bring up game management in the NHL. This is not a crazy conspiracy. This is not me putting on my tinfoil hat. This is something that the NHL very much instructs the officiating crew to do on every single night. They don't want to see games that are incredibly unbalanced in terms of power plays. One team having like 8 power play attempts, the other having 0, which on certain nights when teams are playing that well could absolutely happen. Instead, they are instructed to try and keep a certain balance. And I can say this because it was just a few years ago where one of the NHL referees got caught on a hot mic basically saying as much, saying something along the lines of, oh, I really wanted to call a penalty on this team right here. And so this official ends up getting pushed out of the NHL, and of course they'll say, oh, he went rogue, and this is something that we don't expect from our officiating crew, but it is basically the worst kept secret. This is something that they do, and it's not necessarily a negative. On most nights, it's something you don't really notice, and it does keep games a little bit more competitive, but sometimes a line is crossed, and here tonight, the officials blew past that line and then ended up just being about them pretty much the final half of this game. Now, it started off on this 5-on-3 with that terrible Quinn Hughes penalty, but then what we also ended up seeing is that Elias Pettersson, before Eklund even scored this goal, he flips this puck into the Shark zone and he chases after it himself, cross-checks Celebrini in the back, knocking him down so he could get a great chance in front of the net onto Askarov. The officials do not call this penalty, despite the fact that it is 110% a cross-check, because the Canucks are already down 2 players, and game management-wise, they don't want to have called another penalty against them. Then, after the Sharks actually end up taking the 3-2 lead because of the Adam Gaudette goal that comes pretty soon after the Eklund one, could you believe it? 5 of the next 6 penalties end up going against the San Jose Sharks. Is this because the Sharks were just such a dirty team and taking so many of these infractions? No, it's because any minor thing that the Sharks ended up doing got called, and any minor things that the Canucks did, well, it wouldn't be fair to them because, again, game management. But it really ends up taking off in the final few minutes of this game. First, we see Dmitry Orlov get called for a tripping penalty that really didn't seem like there was much there, not really a trip. And so the referees, to make up for that, just a minute or so later, end up calling Evander Kane for a slashing penalty, and there really wasn't much there either. And so to make up for that, they end up calling a cross-checking penalty on Macklin Celebrini, and would you believe it or not, there wasn't much there either. And then they even end up tacking on an extra couple of minutes for another unsportsmanlike penalty because Celebrini, likely rightfully so, told the referees that they have been doing an absolutely terrible job throughout the night. But it didn't even end there, because in the final 2 seconds of this game, just an absolute comedy of a situation, the officials completely lose control of this game. They have no idea what they're doing. They end up talking about giving penalties to players and then having the face-off come out of the zone, and then they reconvene and they say, actually, the face-off is going to stay in the zone, all with less than 2 seconds to go on the clock. It was just kind of embarrassing to see, honestly. Now, the Sharks, they do come out on the winning side of this game in the end, and so you obviously can't be too frustrated from a Sharks perspective, but I imagine Canucks fans are completely pissed off, and I don't even blame them all that much. This was a disaster of a game from both sides of the officiating crew. The Canucks end up getting called for 7 minor penalties. I believe the Sharks get called for 11 in this game, and this wasn't a game that had like tons of bad blood and tons of chippy plays. This wasn't a Tampa Bay, Florida type of matchup. This was a game just with a lot of ticky-tack calls that didn't really make much sense because the officials completely lost control of the game management perspective here tonight. And so this takes the new title of the worst officiated game of the season for the San Jose Sharks. And it's interesting because the last one was against the Florida Panthers, but that was for an entirely different reason. That was because the officials in that Panthers game missed multiple calls against Florida, and it was frustrating in the moment, but it was one that you could move on from pretty quickly. However, tonight it just felt as though it was maybe inexperience or just a really, really rough night for the officials that should absolutely come with a talking to from the NHL, because that's not something that should be happening again at any point this season, not even for Sharks games, but for any other game in the NHL. Now, when it comes to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line. It is Celebrini and Smith being rejoined by Tyler Toffoli. Now, there are a couple of things to get straight here. Does Tyler Toffoli actually belong on a top line, not just on this team, but anywhere in the NHL with how he has played this season? Absolutely not. Has he done a ton this season to deserve this spot on this top line? Absolutely not. Was this an effective line that the Sharks had previously been running this season? Not really, but he gets put into this situation anyway. The Sharks have tried other alternatives. With Kurashev here, it was maybe slightly better, but still not all that great. With Eklund here, I thought it could have been built upon. I feel as though they probably could have left that together, but it was obviously really bad in the last game against the Colorado Avalanche, and while I certainly don't blame them because every single player was quite bad against the Avs, the Sharks decide to go back to Tyler Toffoli, and at least the positives in this situation are that this trio of players has significantly outscored their opponents at 5-on-5 this season, not necessarily in terms of chances and scoring chances, but in actual goals, they have been able to outplay their opponents. And on top of that, Toffoli has very good on and off ice chemistry with both of these players, and so it is aligned with 3 players who are very, very familiar with each other. This is not optimal, but perhaps Ryan Warsofsky is kind of out of options here and is just going with something that he can feel somewhat comfortable with at this point. Now, when it comes to the individual performances of these players, Macklin Celebrini, I thought had a pretty good game. Obviously, he picks up a couple of assists, which allows him to, at the very least, keep pace with Nathan MacKinnon of the Colorado Avalanche, but actually catching him for that kind of Art Ross Trophy attempt is going to be exceptionally difficult with not only how good MacKinnon has been playing, but how good his entire team has been playing. But a couple of points will help out in that chase. Otherwise, I don't necessarily think this was Celebrini's best game of the season, though the bar is obviously exceptionally high. There were a couple of moments that I thought were somewhat questionable from him. Twice where he was able to get good rush chance opportunities. He has the puck on his stick, and as we know, Celebrini has the best shot on this team, especially with how much Tyler Toffoli has fallen off this this season. You'd like to see him fire that one on net, especially against an inexperienced goaltender between the pipes that the Canucks did end up having. But it's one thing if this were like an odd man rush, a 2-on-1 type of situation where you either take the one-on-one against the goalie or the one-on-one against the defenseman looking to block your pass. But in both of these situations, there were two Canucks players looking to block Celebrini's pass. He had a pretty clear lane to the net, and you'd like to have seen him be more selfish in that situation, especially in a game that was this close. This ends up being just a one-goal night between these two teams. That extra goal, that insurance goal, could have been extremely helpful, but it doesn't end up coming through here. So Celebrini, it was still a fine performance from him, but there could have been more. When it comes to his two line mates, I actually really appreciated Smith's performance here tonight. I've talked about confidence a lot, usually when it comes to the Sharks' younger defensemen that they have in the lineup like Dickinson and Mukhamadullin, but it affects everybody. And Smith, as I mentioned, hasn't been scoring much. The two goals that he did get ended up getting called off. And when a goal scorer is not scoring goals, they can start to feel a little bit down about themselves. So after he gets this one, you could see that it picks up his game. I thought Smith ended up playing a good bit better. This was one of Smith's better performances of the last couple of weeks, which was nice to see. And then when it comes to Tyler Toffoli, he actually did some okay things in this game. He helped facilitate on this top trio. Was he super impactful? Was he extremely noticeable? Definitely not. And that has been the case throughout much of this season. But again, the Sharks are kind of out of options, you could sort of say, on this top line. They could try Colin Graf in this spot, I guess, but it seems as though it's something that Warsofsky doesn't want to go for. And so Toffoli is the kind of band-aid solution onto a top line that is very clearly missing a third player. And at the very least, he didn't do a terrible job in this game. I thought he was all right. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, here we have Eklund and Wenberg, and they're actually joined by Adam Gaudette. So Gaudette gets the promotion up from the third line to the second line, hoping to get a little bit of extra something going here. And I'm not that surprised that this does end up happening. While we have seen Gaudette in the top six before and it has not worked out, it's hard to justify Kurashev continuing to get a spot here because he has not been playing well whatsoever in any of these last few games, and it ended up actually working out. This second line was probably the best offensive performance that they have had in multiple games. That actually starts with William Eklund. Ever since he had come back from injury, he had that first good game against Minnesota. They didn't score, but there were a lot of chances, but then it's been mostly just defensive nights for him over and over and over again. Now, you don't want to draw massive conclusions from a performance here tonight, because like I said, the Canucks usually have been a team that have given up a good amount of shot attempts and a good amount of scoring chances, and so this was an easier night for this second line compared to even what the Sharks will be facing tomorrow against the Vegas Golden Knights, but it was still a strong sign. I really liked Eklund's performance here tonight. I thought he was a lot more effective, looking more so like vintage Eklund in the offensive zone, so that was quite nice to see. I thought Gaudette continued to play the very simple game, very straightforward, pucks to the net, just trying to get it on. I mean, in just the first 30 seconds of this game, I believe he had 3 shots on goal, the first 3 shots on goal of the night. So that was a very clear kind of message. Just try and keep it simple. Don't try to do too much, and let Eklund and Wenberg be the guys who try to set you up for these opportunities. He ends up scoring a goal here in this game, which ends up being the game winner. So a nice night for him. And when it comes to Alex Wenberg, I thought Wenberg was rather solid. Had some decent moments in the offensive zone. There is still that remaining frustration where Wenberg gets 80% of the way there to a good play and then just doesn't have the ability to actually finish out on them. But that's just kind of Wenberg as a player. This isn't a young guy who you're saying, well, if they learn to do this, Wenberg is 30 years old or 31 years old, whatever his age ends up being, this is kind of just what he is. And that's why he's not really much of a second line center in the NHL. But at the moment, the Sharks don't really have a better option. And so here he is, and he does his job decently well. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, this continues to be kind of the island of misfit toys for the San Jose Sharks. It is a third line that doesn't usually be given much thought to the actual construction of it. It is just kind of the rest of the top 9 players. And so tonight it is Kurashev who ends up joining Dellandrea and Graf. This is a third line that didn't really do much of anything from an offensive perspective in this game. Kurashev continues to just be absolutely invisible. I imagine if the Sharks actually had a healthy forward to take a spot in the lineup, Kurashev would end up being a healthy scratch because he's just been doing nothing in these last few games, I would say. Dellandrea and Graf, at the very least, there is some good contributions coming from the Sharks' penalty kill. They end up having to kill off like 8 or 9 different penalties in this game. Can't really count some of the ones at the end of the game because they lasted like a couple of seconds here or there. I believe the NHL ended up clocking officially the Canucks as 0 for 7 on the night, but Graf was definitely a big part of that. So was Dellandrea. They actually were really able to break up plays a lot near the blue line, which is not an easy thing to do when usually it is Quinn Hughes who is commanding the blue line for the Vancouver Canucks. So credit to them for that effort. But at even strength, there's really not much doing for this third line. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Goodrow, Ostapchuk, and Reeves. I thought their first couple of shifts were pretty good, but then they slowly just started not doing much of anything. Now, this was obviously a tough game when it comes to a guy like Ryan Reeves, where you're not really getting him much penalty killing time, and there was just so much sort of special teams play in this game. So even for a player like Ryan Reeves, who is used to not playing much flow in the game, this was obviously even a little bit more difficult than that. However, even with the ice time that he got, it didn't feel as though Ryan Reeves was making his usual type of impact, which is kind of a greater negative than other players, because the thing is that Ryan Reeves, his major tools are the kind of ability to be physical, and that's basically it. Maybe chip in a couple of offensive opportunities, something that we have seen thus far this season, but when that's not happening and that physicality isn't super noticeable, he's not really providing much as that kind of slower player who's not the best defensively. So a bit of a disappointing night for him. When it comes to Barclay Goodrow, credit of course has to go for the penalty kill performance for the San Jose Sharks in this game, and Zach Ostapchuk showcasing a little bit of speed but not necessarily doing a ton in this game. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, after that Colorado Avalanche game, I was hoping that the Sharks would end up actually sticking with the same defensive group. I felt as though that they deserved another chance after a night that, yes, they played quite poorly in, but it was a game that everybody played poorly in, and so it was hard to necessarily pin the fault on any specific player. But Warsofsky decides to make the change anyway when you have 9 defensemen now who need to be kind of sticking here in the NHL. I guess this is something that you have to do. And so we see both Mukhamadullin and surprisingly Vincent Desharnais step out of the lineup in favor of John Klingberg, of course, but also Vincent Iorio. Now we'll start off with the top defensive pairing for the San Jose Sharks for first, with Orlov and Liljegren. The thing I'll say about Liljegren is that I highly suspect that tomorrow he will not be in the lineup for the San Jose Sharks. This was not a particularly great game for Liljegren. He ends up taking 2 penalties in this one. Now, of course, there were a bajillion penalties in this game, and so it's hard to necessarily pinpoint him for all of that blame. This cross-checking call was a little bit hit or miss. I feel as though it was not a terrible call or anything like that, but I've seen those go uncalled. But then the high-sticking one was just really, really obvious. Careless use of the stick from Liljegren, and there was a lot of frustration, I imagine, from Ryan Warsofsky as they cut to him on the bench, not exactly giving the most positive reaction. And then even outside of those 2 penalties, his defensive game was not particularly impressive. His work on that Brock Besser goal was a little bit weak for sure, and so Liljegren likely on the out for the next game. However, his defensive partner wasn't necessarily much better. I didn't think Orlov had a particularly good game either. His work on the power play, you could say, was fine, but at 5-on-5 left a good bit to be desired. When it comes to the Sharks' second pairing, here we have John Klingberg, and this is going to be the controversial statement of controversial statements because John Klingberg actually had a pretty good game in this one. If I was going to look at his entire season, probably like his second best outing of the entire year. Now, that's not saying much because Klingberg, most of his performances this season have been quite abysmal, if not just like extremely irredeemable, but this was a good outing for him. Now, from an offensive perspective, there wasn't a ton doing. I thought he had a couple of really bright spots in the first period that got me excited for what we would see from him in the rest of the game, and then that slowed down a bit, and there wasn't much doing in the second and third, but he was actually surprisingly very responsible in his own zone, not too many errors being made there, had a couple of decent breakout passes, so it's not as though this was a spectacular game from Klingberg in the grand scheme of things, but he had a pretty efficient night and was one of the Sharks' better defensemen. And so, as much as I don't really want to see him in the lineup because I don't really view this as something that is going to happen consistently, I don't feel as though I'm going to pull my hair out if he ends up in the lineup for tomorrow's game against the Vegas Golden Knights, which at this point seems like will end up being the case. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, I thought Ferraro was all right. I've been more impressed with him recently, outside of that Colorado game, obviously, than I was tonight. I thought it was an okay performance for Ferraro. I have seen better from him, but on the penalty kill, I will definitely give him credit. Does a lot of the work down low, and in this game, usually he had been previously paired with Vincent Deharnay in that penalty killing role, but with him out of the lineup, Ferraro had to get somebody else and had to take on the mantle of maybe a bit more of an active penalty killing role, and I thought he did that decently well, at least. Obviously, relying on your goaltender a good bit, but when you take this many penalties, or at least this many penalties get called, you're going to have to rely on your goalie, and Ferraro did just his best in that type of situation, which I do appreciate, but at 5-on-5, maybe a little bit shakier, but still pretty good. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, here we have the other new defenseman of the lineup. It is Vincent Iorio, and this is his first NHL game in a while. He had sat out multiple games, then ended up getting dropped down to the AHL for a conditioning stint where he was very successful with the San Jose Barracuda, and so I was excited to see what he could do here. I have not really been impressed much with Iorio this season, but at the very least then I could use the excuse of, okay, he's coming to a completely new team, completely new systems, and so it'll take some time to adjust. I was hopeful that adjustment period will have occurred coming into tonight and he could at least be pretty good, but I don't really think he was. First of all, he takes like the craziest penalty of all time, it felt as though. I'm not sure what exactly he's doing in this interference penalty. It looked like his controller just disconnected and he's just attached to Connor Garland and not letting him move for a good 5 or 6 seconds here. Again, not entirely sure what the thought process was there, but that's not a good call to have been taken. And then generally, it just felt as though he was a step behind at times in this game. I thought penalty killing wise, I was watching him and just kind of wishing that it was Vincent Deharnay in the lineup instead, especially since we know Deharnay and Dickinson have very good chemistry together. And so Iorio's in this pretty tough spot where the Sharks now have 9 defensemen up in the NHL. That is not an optimal situation. At the very least, one of them needs to be shipped out or waived or whatever the case may be. And Iorio at this point is kind of looking like a guy who is too good for the AHL, but not quite good enough to actually find a home in the NHL either. So I don't exactly know what the Sharks will doing. Perhaps the fact that Iorio got this game in the first place is a good sign that the Sharks are maybe looking at Nick Leddy as their 9th defenseman, and perhaps Nick Leddy is bound to be put on waivers sooner rather than later, and then they keep Iorio around as like an 8th defenseman, and then they rotate with 7 main guys. But it's not as though like Iorio is some sort of key player for the San Jose Sharks at this point. I have not seen a ton of great signs from him, at least at the NHL level. Again, I know he was quite good with the San Jose Barracuda, but the Sharks should have some tough decisions coming up soon. When it comes to his defensive partner, Sam Dickinson, I was worried that Dickinson would be taken out of the lineup for tonight's game. At yesterday's practice, they did have him outside of that top 6, but Warsofsky makes the call to keep him in. I thought that was 100% correct. Now, we didn't get to see the same type of offensive performance as we did at moments in the last game against the Colorado Avalanche, and it feels as though this was a pretty clear decision made by Dickinson. He likely thought as though his defensive game was not good enough against Colorado, which is technically the case, although literally every single defenseman was not good enough against Colorado. And so instead of maybe being very aggressive offensively, he tried to handle himself a bit more defensively, and you could say that that certainly worked out. I thought he made some strong decisions. I thought he was pretty good in his own zone, so it wasn't a spectacular game from Sam Dickinson or anything like that. He didn't do much to try to jump into the rush and make plays or anything like that, but he got some shots to the net. He did his best in his own zone, and so it was an all-right performance from him, and I'll be very interested to see whether or not he remains in the lineup for the next game. If I had to bet, it would be Liljegren and Iorio stepping out in favor of Mukhamadullin and Vincent Deharnay, and Dickinson does get the next game. However, because it is the second half of a back-to-back, obviously in pretty much every previous back-to-back, Dickinson has sat out. We'll see if finally Ryan Warsofsky will begin to give him a little bit more leash and allow him to play in these types of games, because at some point, as an NHL defenseman, you will have to get used to it. And last year, we saw Will Smith near this same time this season actually be given back-to-back games. We'll see if the Sharks take that same approach with Dickinson, who certainly deserves to remain in the lineup. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender Yaroslav Askarov. Now, this was a pretty interesting game for Askarov, because if you actually do look at both of these goals that he did give up, they were not necessarily the best. This Brock Besser goal, there is some traffic in front, but this puck does come from relatively far out, and so it beats Askarov rather cleanly. It's not as though this was an easy save for him to make, but in previous games in the month of November, we have seen him make saves like this, and so it was a little bit of surprise early on. And then on the Pettersson Pedersen goal. This is a bit of a technical mistake from Askarov as well. Instead of kind of keeping stretched out to prevent this last-ditch attempt from Pedersen, who is on the ice and really can't get much of a better shot than just sending it towards the net, it looks as though he kind of attempts to reset a little bit, which ends up catching him by surprise, and this puck deflects in. It's a little bit unlucky as well, but if Askarov had played it better, this is not a goal. However, looking past these two goals against, he made a tremendous amount of really good saves, especially on the penalty kill where he came up huge on multiple different occasions, and at the end of the night, he was very, very good for the San Jose Sharks as a whole. With average goaltending, the Sharks probably give up at least like 4 goals in this game, a couple of those on those penalty kills. And so Askarov, as he has been throughout the pretty much entire month of November, outside of that Colorado game a couple of nights ago, he comes through for the Sharks, and he is once again probably their MVP of the night. Now, I will say one other thing. As the San Jose Sharks, they put up 3 goals here tonight. 2 do come on the power play, which is encouraging, although one of them is on the 5-on-3, but it is again just 1 goal in a 5-on-5 situation. And if you take a look at the Sharks' performance through November, they have been getting a lot of wins, but this is entirely off of the back of Askarov keeping the puck out of the net. Coming into tonight's game, the Sharks had the 5th best goals against per game through the month of November, but they are the worst scoring team in the entire league as well in this month. And the problem with that is that in terms of the chances that the Sharks give up, it is seemingly inevitable that Yaroslav Askarov's stats will come down, that they will regress back to a lower level. And this isn't necessarily me being like rude or anything like that. This is not me not having any faith with Askarov, but he's not just playing good, he's not just playing great, he's not just playing Vezina winning caliber. He is on like another level entirely. If he were to put up the performance that he has in November throughout an entire season, he would have had the best goaltending season in like the entire history of the NHL. And so it is just unbelievable that such a thing would occur. Even if he regresses just to Vezina winning numbers, this would still amount to the Sharks giving up more goals against. And the problem is that their goals for numbers aren't really due for regressions in the positive sense, because in terms of actual 5-on-5 play, they don't generate much of anything. And so them scoring just 1 5-on-5 goal here tonight, 0 in the game before that against the Colorado Avalanche, it's actually not that much of a surprise. And so unless the Sharks are actually able to start generating more offense moving forward, at some point Askarov is not just going to be able to be the complete workhorse that he has been through the month of November. And the Sharks, a lot of these more positive victories will start turning into more negative losses, especially when you consider the fact that a lot of these wins have been by 1 goal, and we saw just how quickly those types of 1-goal outings can change just last season when the Sharks lost pretty much every single one of them, again, due to bad goaltending then, and they're winning it now due to good goaltending. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. They'll be taking on the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, coming into this season, it was expected that the Golden Knights would not only be the best team in the Pacific Division, but likely by far the best team in the Pacific and perhaps even the best team in the Western Conference, due to the fact that they added an elite talent in Mitch Marner. But the Golden Knights have been actually rather disappointing thus far this season. Certainly not the level, not even close to the level that they were thinking that they would be playing at. And it is an interesting opportunity for the Sharks to get a bit of revenge as well. If we go back all the way to game 1 of the season, the opening night, the Sharks actually had a very good chance of winning that game. They were playing rather well, but then a couple of errors being made by Nedeljkovic caused the Sharks to end up losing that game in overtime. And interestingly enough, Nedeljkovic will be getting the start tomorrow, a chance for redemption on his own. And so we'll see how the Sharks are able to respond against that division rival. Class dismissed.